India has been a serious maritime power for 5,000 years. In fact, we are the only country in the world which actually has an ocean named after it. And I hope to be able to prove to you that there is good reason for this, because we are among the great maritime nations of history. We have a history that is full of exploration, trade, exchange from a maritime neighborhood. Unfortunately, that is not how Indian history is widely perceived. Now, why that is the case, I do not know, but at least part of it must be because our capital happens to be in Delhi, so maybe we have ended up with a landlocked view of the world. So if you happen to live in Delhi, I suppose your only neighbors look like our friendly neighbor to the west and the other friendly neighbor to our northeast. But if you happen to have a more maritime view of the world, then the view of the world changes quite rapidly. And all of a sudden, our neighbors are countries like Oman, the UAE, Singapore, Indonesia, indeed, a country that is named after India. And Singapore also, by the way, the name is derived from Singhapura. So these are countries with which we have thousands of years of links. Even Australia, very often we think of it as a Pacific country, but is in fact an Indian Ocean country. And when we take an Indian Ocean view of things, as you will see, it has a very different view of our geopolitics, our economics, and of course of our history as well. And if you look at our legends, if you go to our temples and look at the sculptures, if you look at old manuscripts, they are full of references to some boat, foreign voyages, ships, all kinds of such things. Now here are just two images of it. One of them is from the Jagannath temple in Puri, and the other is a representation from the Babarnama. The reason I have it there on the screen is not merely that they are representations of ships. One of them on the right is almost certainly a river ship. The other one could be a river ship or seafaring ship. But the reason I want you to have a close look at it, I don't know if it's clear enough, is if you look at how the ship is put together. It's a unique technology by which Indians, for reasons that we can debate, would stitch their ships together. So if you look very carefully at those ribs along the hull, they are the result of stitching the ship together. In other words, we did not use nails to put our ship together till modern times. Okay, I want to pay attention to that because that's an important part of what I will talk about. Now, we have been sailing these oceans for a very, very long time. This is a Harappan comb found in a place called Salut in Oman, along with beads and other things. And it is important to remember that Indians had been crisscrossing the Arabian Sea from at least the Bronze Age. So one of the first things we did as we built our first civilization was to use that to begin to sail the oceans. And I sadly don't have the map here, but it is also important to understand that the landscape that they were traversing was very different from the landscape that we have today. So the sea levels, for example, were about 5 to 10 meters higher than they are today. So when you look at Gujarat, you see a peninsula. But if you went back to Harappan times, the Saurashtra Peninsula and Kutch were actually islands. And what you call now the run of Kutch was actually sea. So you could actually sail ships through much of what is now the salt flats of the run of Kutch. And they were the estuaries of two major rivers. One was the Indus, which till as recently as the 19th century used to actually flow into one end of the run of Kutch. It was an earthquake in the 19th century that shifted it to where it is today. And another river called the Saraswati, which used to also flow in. So if you came to the run of Kutch area, 7,000 years ago, it would have looked like the Sundarbans. Which is why, one interesting thing, if you look at the seals of the Indus Valley, you will see there are no lions in them. There are only tigers. And you'll find rhinos. These are all wet country animals. Right? There are no... the Indian rhino is a wet country animal. Unlike the African rhino, which is a savanna animal, the Indian rhino is a wet country rhino. And there are no rhinos in and around Gujarat, Rajasthan, or Western India. You find them in the other extreme of the country, in Assam and West Bengal. But the Harappan seals have rhinos, the Harappan seals have tigers, no lions. So this was the landscape that you had. And from this landscape, there was major ports. And the biggest port was Dholavira. Now, Dholavira is today on an island which is stuck in the middle of an island in the middle of the salt flats. And, it's difficult today to imagine that it was a port. But as I told you, Saurashtra was a island, and the Run of Kutch was navigable. So people would actually sail through the Run of Kutch to reach this island called Khadir Island, and there was this port. And they could sail from two different directions. One is they could sail from the south. So when they were sailing from the south, you would go past Lothal. So if you've been to Lothal, you will see that it's actually today landlocked as well. But when the sea levels were higher, you could sail right past Lothal. And if you've been to Lothal, the other thing you will notice is that it's got this big dry dock, which is famous, of course, but it has a very small habitation there. So why build such a large dry dock for such a small habitation? And that habitation is also mostly made up of a large warehouse and some platforms which look like they were there for checking and so on. The reason for this, at least this is my guess, others may disagree, is that actually Lothal was not a port. It was actually a customs depot. So if you were coming up the Konkan coast, you had to go past Lothal, which was a choking point. And this is where your stuff was unloaded, that was checked. The customs people looked at it. You had to pay them tax, maybe pay them a bribe, who knows? They were Indians after all. And they would give you a seal, tax paid, and then you weren't allowed to go to Dholavira. So that was one direction. The other direction they would sail out to, you could go from Dholavira, past through the outward, westward, and then you could sail out towards the Persian Gulf. And when you sailed out, you went past another place called Dwarka. Now, Dwarka literally means the gateway. The gateway to what? The gateway to the Middle East. And so, there were 5,000 years ago, Indian merchants sailing out to Oman, sailing out further in to Bahrain, and all the way to the Sumerian cities. And there are records there of a people called the Meluhans in Sumerian texts, because our own inscriptions we have not been able to decipher. So, but the Sumerian inscriptions, these clay tablets have been deciphered, and you can read the clay tablets, and they mention a people called the Meluhans, who came to these Sumerian towns from the east, bearing with them peacocks and beads and other things, and of course elephant tusks, these are obviously coming from India and specifically from Gujarat. And they were there to trade, and not only trade, they are actually descriptions of enclaves of villages in and around Sumerian towns of these people. So these people, so if you go to the Middle East and you see lots of Indians there, remember that this has been going on for a very long time. Indians have been there for trading or whatever other purposes, and they were large enough in number to have their own enclaves. So this is where we hear for the first time a mention of an Indian outside of India. So there is a court case in which a Meluhan is accused of breaking the tooth of a local in a drunken brawl. And the Meluhan is found to be guilty, and he has to pay silver coins. So we know that he was accused and that he was found guilty, and he had to pay a fine of several silver coins for breaking the tooth of the local. And I guess this is the origins of prohibition in Gujarat. Now, this world that I just described suddenly fell apart around about 2000 to 1900 BC. The climate changed, the Saraswati dried up. Interestingly, the sea levels also fell. So interestingly, the sea levels don't only go up or down, they go up and down, and there is multi-directional movement in this. And so as the sea levels fell, they left behind what we know as the Run of Kutch, so all the salt flats. And the Sumerian cities also fell. So it didn't only happen in India. The climate change, it became much drier. And there were these huge droughts which caused the collapse of the Harappan cities. And you then have a complete change in the landscape. But that doesn't mean that seafaring Indians stopped. This continued to happen. But a lot of this now shifted southward along the Konkan, Karnataka, Malabar coast. And on the other coastline as well, as Indians began to move out from the Kalinga, Bengal area, particularly the westernmost outlet of the Ganga, which we now call the Hooghly River. But there were major ports there through the Iron Age and later, Chandraketugarh, which is just north of Kolkata, and Tamluk or Tamralipti, which is near IIT Kharagpur, by the way. And from there were many Indian merchants sailing all over the Indian Ocean. And initially they did not have the technology of crossing the seas. They would hug the coast. And so these Bengali Odia merchants sail all the way down to the Sri Lanka. And one of the sources of the Sri Lankan population is actually from Odisha, Bengal area. Another one also came from the other side, from the Maharashtra coast. So the population that you now know as Sri Lankan, or Sinhalese of Sri Lankan, is a result of a mixture of Bengali Odia from one side and Maharashtrians from the other side. So they took quite a lot of their genes from the west and a lot of the culture from the east for whatever reason. Now, they were also sailing in the other direction. And initially what they were doing, they were sailing, hugging the coast, and they would go to this place called the Isthmus of Kra. This is the bit of Thailand near Phuket from which Malaysia hangs off. And they would cross to the other side, and then they would sail out towards the Mekong Delta all the way through to Japan, to China, to Korea. And in fact, people don't realize this, that in the Korean textbooks that they teach in school, the history of Korea starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya, of all places, and who came there by ship. So we were obviously going back and forth, and there's a huge amount of influence. We of course know of the Buddhist influence, which is better known, but lesser known is that even in northeast India, there is a huge amount of Hinduism. There's lots of remains of Hindu temples along the Chinese coast. And also interestingly, Shintoism. The word Shinto is actually derived from Sindhu. Just like in the West, the word Hindu comes from Sindhu, the word Shinto also comes from Sindhu. And there is Shintoism, as you will see. These are all worshipped gods in Shinto temples in Japan to this day. They are worshipping Ganesh, they are worshipping Saraswati. These are widespread, so people know, of course, of Buddhism, which is well known, but lesser understood is the living tradition of Hinduism in Japan, which continues to today. And of course, they are both mixed. So, Buddhist and Shinto temples have shrines to each other. So there's a huge amount, and of course there is huge influence of Buddhism and Hinduism throughout Southeast Asia. I mean, there are places like Bali, for example, which is still very much Hindu island. Now, while this was going eastward, westward we were also trading with the Greeks, the Arabs, the Persians, and of course the Romans. And a huge amount, hundreds of ships were going back and forth. There's a huge amount of trade that was happening in both coasts. Now, an important thing that I want to tell you is that much of this trade, people have the impression, is being done by these heroic single merchants who are sailing out on their own. That may have been true in the very early stages, but certainly by the Pallava period, that's the 7th, 8th century, and even more developed by the by the Chola period, the high imperial Chola period, which is around about 1,000 years ago, most of the trade actually was done by corporatized guilds. So I want to make this clear. These were organized multinational companies. And they had colorful names like the 500. I'm assuming that 500 came from the number of shareholders they had. And these corporatized guilds were large institutions with branches all over the Indian Ocean. They had their own navy, because as you can imagine, there was a lot of piracy, as there is even today. And interestingly, they would survive many dynasties. So dynasties and empires would come and go, but the 500 would remain, suggesting that even the kings did not mess with these chaps, because they were obviously both economically and even perhaps militarily quite powerful. Also interesting is how all of this network of trade was financed. So you all know about the great Hindu temples of the medieval period and how much gold they had. We usually know about this because of the records of their sackings later on. And many people may have the impression that they had such a lot of gold because Indian kings were handing over all their gold and precious jewels to them. Now let me assure you that even 1,000 years ago, it was very difficult to get Indian politicians to hand over their money to anyone. So the reason that they had such a lot of gold is because they were banks. So these Hindu temples were the main source of funding for all these great voyages, these corporate guilds, corporatized merchant guilds, and also the artisan guilds. So there would be tripartite agreements between the temple bank, the artisan guild to produce maybe cloth or whatever it is, and the merchant guild. That is how this whole thing functioned. That's why there was so much gold in the temples, because they were basically using this for, and some of the contracts that they had is still available in copper plate, particularly in southern India, where some of them survive, these temples survived. There are copper plate contracts. Some of the contracts are even chiseled onto the walls of some of these temples, some of the big contracts. So we know about them quite well. So this is how this trade was happening. So when the Turkic conquests caused a great amount of the sacking of these great temples, it wasn't just a socio-cultural shock. It was a major economic shock to the Indians, because their financing capability suddenly came to a grinding halt. And you see, from around the 13th century onwards, slowly the Indians begin to disappear from the merchant, this long tradition I told you, going back to Harappan times till well past the Chola period. We were the great mariners of the world, and then as this maritime capability fell apart, we also this financing capability fell apart. We also lost our maritime capability. Financing these voyages is expensive business, and as it fell apart, our ability to build big ships, etc., also declined. Nonetheless, enough of it survived that even when the early Europeans were coming, they would, like you would see Marco Polo, etc., they would mention that Indians were building these great ships. So here are some of the records that we have of foreign travelers mentioning these ships. So Ptolemy, this is the Roman period, 1st century, he mentions that Indian shipbuilders built a fleet of about 2,000 ships, each capable of accommodating 1,000 troops, horses, and vast quantities of supplies. Now this is a huge ship even by modern standards. Then you have Marco Polo. He says ships were so large in size that they had crew of 150 to 300 men. Propelled by oars and sails, multiple decks, over 60 cabins of merchants, cargo holds, ships divided by bulkheads, and fastened by iron nails. I'm mentioning iron nails here specifically because, as I will discuss later, most of the ships were actually stitched together, but we did use nails for some ships, so we were aware of the technology of nails. Then there is Niccolo Conti, 1400. talks about ships weighing 1,000 tons with 5 sails. And then there is Santo Stefano, 50 years later, writing about timbers of ships were stitched together with cords and sails made of cotton. So there are all these records of foreign visitors to the Indian Ocean who saw all of this, and before Vasco da Gama turned up. So, we tend to have this mental image that only when Vasco da Gama turned up, that between Alexander and Vasco da Gama, Europeans never came here. That's not the case. There were plenty of Europeans wandering around the Indian Ocean region before Vasco da Gama. So what of our own records? So there are many records in our own texts which talk about shipbuilding. I'll mention one of them. It's called Yukti Kalpataru. It was put together by Raja Bhoj in the 10th, 11th century. And in that, there are many descriptions of many things, but he also tells us about maritime activity and shipbuilding, specifically talks about how big these ships were. So he tells us that ships were classified as Vishesha or ordinary, Samanya or ordinary, and Vishesha, which is special. And he also tells us that they had these ratios, length to breadth ratios of 1:4 if they were ordinary ships, and the latter, which was the special ships, was just 1:8. I find this particular ratio 1:8 quite surprising, because it would make the ship really thin and narrow. So I'm not 100% sure how stable they were. Maybe they had outriggers. I'm not sure. We don't know. But these kinds of Vishesha ships existed, and these Vishesha ships particularly were used for seafaring activities. So I'm not, again, very sure why. But I'm just telling you what the text says. Now, these Samanya or ordinary ships were subclassified as per size. So they had all these names: Shudra, Madhyama, Bhima, etc. And then there were those which were special category ships. We were subclassified as Dirgha, Unnata, and so on. So I have given you the length and breadth of the Vishesha ships, which were 1:8 ratio. But if you go right to the bottom, you can see some of them are huge. You've got like the Begini, which is the biggest, is 176 cubit long. It's a very long ship, but very narrow, 22 breadth. So again, I am not exactly sure what particular, maybe it had a particular purpose which we don't know about, or maybe it was used for fast naval activities. I have no idea, but I'm just telling you what it is. So this is, of course, a text, but we also have representations. So here is a representation of a ship in Ajanta cave number 2. This is obviously from the 4th, 5th century, and it's a stitch ship. It has 3 masts, as you can see. Sadly, the thing is that the image is a little, the painting is damaged, but you can see enough of it that you can be able to tell there is a man standing there. If you can look very closely, there are these pots of water, and so on, and so on and so forth. Now, there are a few characteristics of the ship. One is that it does not have a rudder. It has a trailing oar, and I will come back to it as well. Also, we can see, you may not be able to tell, but it's actually also stitched together. So there are this rough design was the design. Also note that it uses square sails. Those of you who have any nautical knowledge will know that later on sailing ships would end up using lantern sails, which are triangular sails, which have an advantage that you can sail at an angle to the wind. Square sails, mostly you have to sail with the wind. So it limits the direction you can go. So in this early stage, there were square sails, trailing oars, stitched ships. So this is how it was built. And this stitching technique, by the way, would continue to be used in India as the primary method, despite the knowledge of nails, and despite the fact that Indians specifically knew how to make rust-free nails, which is obviously important if you are using it for a ship. So right here next door to you in Mehrauli, you have a rust-free iron pillar. Now, so we knew how to make rust-free nails, but somehow they were not that popular. And in fact, we would keep using this particular technology till at least the time that the Europeans turned up, even for naval warfare. Ultimately, when we gave it up, we did not give it up because of reasons of efficiency, We gave it up because stitched ships were not particularly good at taking the back blow of cannons. So never mind the other guy's cannon, your own cannon, if you were using a cannon on a stitched ship, would stretch the fibers, and so ultimately it was not particularly good for use of cannon. So that's why ultimately it was abandoned. We continue to make, however, to this day, small fishing boats using this technique. And you can see along the Karnataka coast, there are these very small fishing boats that are still made using this stitched boat, stitch technique to building these small boats. But they're very, very small boats. So it's been generations since we have built a big ship using this technique. However, there has been some other people who have taken an interest in trying to do this, because while the Indians were using this, remember, the Arabs also took on this technique of stitch ships, and they used tip ships, particularly the Omani. In fact, these ships were made in India. Even in ancient times, the Arab ships were mostly made in India, because remember, they don't have wood on their side. So they would buy ships on our end and sail it back and forth. There was a slight difference in design, but by and large, the dhows of the Arabs were actually Indian-built ships. And so they were reasonably similar. And the Omanis in recent times have made some effort. So they rebuilt one ship called the Sohar in 81-82, which was a 9th century ship. Then they, later on in 2008-9, they built the Jewel of Muscat, which is based on a 9th century shipwreck in Indonesia. The Greeks also have built a stitch ship in 2013 called the Gyptus. And there's a ship now being built more recently in 2013, Al Hariri, although this has not been sailed, it was for exhibition only. So the question then arose, why don't we build a ship, a stitch ship? And so a few years ago, I wrote up a plan for this, and I took it up to various senior people, and with the support particularly of the Honorable Prime Minister, we are now actually going to build a recreated ship based on that painting I showed you earlier of the Ajanta painting and the Yukti Kalpataru and other evidence that we have. So what is the idea? So one is just a reconstruction of a ship to see how these ships used to be, revive cultural memories. Since this ship will not have any modern equipment, will allow us to understand the monsoons, the equatorial currents, to see how actually in ancient times they used to use. Of course, it will bring back a sense of pride in Indian maritime heritage, which is sadly not adequately appreciated by us. And of course, to try out some of these ancient sailing ships, this is of course a good way of also a way of building some links to our traditional cultural neighbors. So how are we going about building this stitch ship? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how these stitch ships were built. So the materials required were obviously there's wood, but I'm not going to talk about the wood because there are different kinds of wood that are used for different parts. So there is the jack tree wood that's heavier. There's some part is done by teak. All of this which we are using is going to come, these are from the Malabar coast, Western Ghats, because that's where we used to get our traditional wood. And then we are going to use coir rope. So when the stitching is done, as I will show you, it uses coir rope. It's not the same coir rope you can buy here. It is a much denser coir rope, stronger. It's also weathered using salt. It's put in salt water and treated, and then it is also soaked with coconut oil. And then that is the coir rope that is used. Then there's coconut fiber for filling the joints, needles for stitching, kudrus resin. This is an important thing. Kudrus resin, which you can see if they're right on the, you can see it on the left, extreme left. There's this resin is what is used. It's first soaked in fish oil, sardine oil actually, and then it becomes liquidy, and then it is put into the holes and gaps, and then it is allowed to dry. And once it dries, it becomes quite hard. So in case you're wondering how the gaps and the holes are filled, it's with this resin called kudrus. There's of course fish oil, and there's limestone powder, some brick red pigment for painting and all that. And this is how it is done. The first step is to lay the keel. By the way, the ship is now, as we speak, being built in Goa in a shipyard called Hodi in island of Devar Island. In fact, if you're familiar with Goa, there's an island called Devar Island. It's a river island. And if you go there, you can go and see this being built. So the first thing is you lay the keel, which is the bottom part. And that is done. Then what you have to do, you use steaming to bend the planks. So this is kind of important because you see, unlike a normal construction or the modern construction, where basically you build a frame and then you nail or bolt or weld the hull onto the frame. In a stitch ship, actually the hull is built first, and then later on a light frame is built inside. So the hull itself has to be kind of shaped. So how do you get wood in that shape? The way it is done is you take these planks of wood and you steam them. And when you steam it, the fiber becomes a little loose. So when it's a little soft, and that's when you shape it and let it again dry. So that is how it is set in a particular angle. And then you remove it, and then you quickly shape it in the desired shape, and you repeat the process over and over again for all the planks. Then you take pairs of holes along the planks and you build holes along them in this 1-1-X, 1-1-X. That is the pattern in which it is done. And you can see how the holes are done along the thing, and then you create these pegs and you stitch it together. And then the kudrus resin is supplied between the planks, and that's how it is built. You get a better sense of how this is done. And then the frame is then also stitched into it. And this is how the ship begins to look after a little, after it comes together. More of it. Now, this is the pictures I showed you are partly of the new ship we are building and partly from the Jewel of Muscat with the Omanis were building. Just so that you understand. So how are we going about it? Well, first of all, we've got funding from the Ministry of Culture. And then with the help of the Indian Navy, we have designed the ship based on, I told you, the original painting. And then the Ministry of External Affairs, we will need, because we are doing these voyages, we will need the help on the other side to get friendly countries on the other side. And then, of course, we will need the Ministry of Shipping to certify the ship to be safe. Remember, these are, we are going to go into the open ocean. So this is the thing. And then, so I've worked with all of these people and, designed a ship. So here are a few other concepts. As I said, the concept comes from the 4th, 5th century ocean-going ship. I've created a sketch here, this schematic sketch from the painting, so that you know what we are trying to hit. There are other depictions also, so we have used those. And then there are some surviving rope building traditions that are still around. So this is important because you see, today only those very small boats are being built using this technique. But till a few generations ago, a little bit bigger boats were also being built. And of course, in ancient times, very big ships were built. So this technique is very rapidly dying out. But there are still a few traditional artisans who remember these techniques. Many of the rules of thumb about how so they don't do it the way we are creating these sketches and all of that. They know it all as rules of thumb. Very often these are in rhymes that have been come down to them. Or father to son traditions. So we found a gentleman called Babu Sankaran, comes from a family that has built ships for who knows how long. I mean, they have, as far as he knows, their family has always built ships. His son was wanted to go out and do other things because the traditional shipbuilding is now dying out. But because of this project, he got very excited. So his son is also working on this project. And so this is the concept design and line drawings of the ship we are actually building. It's 21 meters long, so it's not a small ship. It has 2 masts, not 3, and a foresail as well. So you have some sense of what this ship will look like. We have already started in September last year, and by this time next year, the ship will be complete. So end of 2024, early 25, the ship will be complete. And once the ship is complete, this is the illustrative photograph from the Jewel of Muscat, but we will then put it in the sea and then fit it out. So put the mast in, create the cabins and other things. And then it will require 6 further months of kitting out, etc. So early 25 through to the middle of 25, we will kit it out. Again, photos from the Jewel of Muscat for the purpose of illustration. And then we have to do sea trials. After all, just because it floats doesn't mean you can actually use it. Now, there are a few elements which I need to show you of these ships which are different from normal ships. It's important that you see it here. See, first of all, you can see that there is no rudder. There is a trailing oar. Okay? This is what ships used to use in pre-modern times. Now, these trailing oars have certain characteristics which we do not know what their sailing characteristics are. So what happens if you're in a storm, and how do you control the ship using a trailing oar? We don't know. By all accounts, it's probably quite inefficient. Probably requires a lot of skill to use it. But I'm just telling you this. So this is just one of many problems we will face when we actually try to sail this. The next problem, of course, is the fact that since we have stitched the hull together, it is flexible. It's not rigid. So when it is going through storm or heavy waters, the hull will actually flex a little bit. Now, is this good or is it bad? We don't know. We can only find out by actually sailing it. Then, of course, there is the problem of using square sails. Now, no modern sailing ship uses square sails. We almost entirely use lantern sails, which are more triangular type sails, which means that you can sail at various angles. Now, what happens if the wind is not quite blowing in the direction we want? How do we deal with this? There's some leeway. You can use those trailing oar, some leeways. There must be some technique. After all, these people were sailing these waters for hundreds of years. But we don't know exactly what that technique is. So I'm just telling you that these are the problems that we will face with. And this is just for model testing. We have created a first glance. It's a very small version of it. But just so that you know what this thing will look like when we are done with it. Now, there are 2 directions that we can sail with it. One is we can sail the old route that I showed you right in the beginning, the Harappan route. We could sail from Mandvi to Muscat and then go even further into the Persian Gulf. And there's the other one that we could sail on the other coast, from Odisha down the coast, using the winter winds. From the Kartik Purnima onwards, you get the winter winds. And then we can sail all around to Sri Lanka, use the equatorial currents to go over to Sumatra, and then you sail along the coast of Java to reach Bali. There's to this day a festival in Indonesia called Bali Jatra, which literally means the voyage to Bali. And this voyage would, by the way, take as much as 3 months. So we'd probably start off at Bali Jatra and Kartik Purnima, which is usually middle of November. Winds at that time blow from north to south, so you can see why they used to sail out at that time. And then they would sail to Sri Lanka, use the currents to cross, and then use the further winds to go down. So that would be a recreation of the Bali Jatra. So this is one route, and the other is the other route. Now, on December 16th, there was a joint statement by the Sultan of Oman, who was visiting India, and His Excellency the Prime Minister of India, saying that the very first voyage of this will happen in N25-26 to Oman. So we now know which particular voyage we'll do. It is the shorter voyage to Oman, so it says here, the leaders appreciate a proposal by the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, to recreate a maritime voyage of a stitch ship crafted with ancient knowledge in India. The tentative plan is for the ship to sail from the port of Mandvi in Gujarat to Muscat sometime in 25-26, followed by further voyages to other regions. So this is now on. We are building the ship. I now have about a year to figure out how to learn how to sail. The Navy has kindly agreed to give me about 12 crew members, and a captain. And this is what, on the 10th of February, I had gone to look at what the progress was. So this is what it looked like. You can see that the stitching is going on, and that is the external frame that will be used to put the planks in. So this is what it looked like about a month ago when I went to see the place. And so with that, the voyage begins.
I wanted to ask that these voyages which we are building from the ancient knowledge, will they serve the purpose of revoking the ancient memories only, or will they have a technical upper hand from current voyages? And also, other thing I want to ask is that what should be the key takeaways for students of social sciences who are not studying maritime studies?
So, look, I mean, the primary objective is to recreate these ancient voyages and use it in a way to re-establish contact with other countries with whom we have had ancient links. And they're very excited about it as well. As you can see, the Sultan of Oman was very keen to welcome this voyage. So it has a modern implication, but in a geostrategic, external affairs kind of way, soft power kind of way. I don't know if there is a technological implication of doing this. Nevertheless, for the fun of it, since I have access to the Navy's architects and their testing systems, we are in fact subjecting this design to also all the tests that they would do to a normal Navy ship. Because it's not often that you're going to do this. So I actually, in October, I had actually made a presentation on the stitch ship, but a technical engineering, naval engineering presentation at IIT Delhi in the Naval Architecture School, where I explained all the Navier-Stokes equations and how the flow dynamics would work. And now we are going to take the scale down model which we have created, and we are actually taking it to IIT Madras, where they do have a testing pool. So we will subject it to all the testing requirements, because as I said, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to subject something like this to actual testing. So we have already done the computer dynamics part of it and modeling. We will now subject it to the testing pool, and later on we will do all the tests again and take the measurements in an actual voyage. So this will allow us to do something interesting, which is to see what happens as a result of a flexible hull and on this. So we are recording it from it. I am not holding my breath that we will make some great technological innovation as a result of this, but nonetheless the technical details of it are being recorded for posterity for whatever it's worth.
नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन आई थिंक।
गुड इवनिंग सर, मेरा नाम मयंक है और मैं इंटरनेशनल रिलेशन का स्टूडेंट हूँ। सर, जैसा कि मैंने देखा कि एक मैरीटाइम को लेकर एक हिस्टोरिकल कंटिन्यूटी है और स्ट्रेटजीज में भी कंटिन्यूटी है, पर अभी के समय में नए जियोपॉलिटिकल कंडीशंस के अंदर इंडिया में वो जो कॉन्शियसनेस है मैरीटाइम को लेकर, वो कितना ज़्यादा विजिबल हो पा रहा है, खासकर जब हम मैरीटाइम स्ट्रेटजीज की बात करते हैं?
तो हमारी एक ये समस्या है कि आधुनिक भारत में एक सी ब्लाइंडनेस है हमारे जो जियो स्ट्रेटेजिक कॉन्शियसनेस है उसमें मैरीटाइम कॉन्शियसनेस बहुत ही कम रहा है अभी तक। लेकिन एक बदलाव आया है शायद इसलिए कि हमारे जो अभी जो प्रधानमंत्री हैं नरेंद्र मोदी जी, वो एक कोस्टल स्टेट से हैं, तो शायद इसलिए थोड़ा सा एक बदलाव आया है थोड़ी हमारी सोच में, और इसका प्रभाव हमको आज भी दिख रहा है। तो देखिए, नेवी में जितना हम लोगों ने नौसेना में पिछले 10 साल में जो निवेश किया है, आपने पहले देखा ही नहीं होगा। कितने सारे नए शिप्स आए हैं, उनका टेक्नोलॉजिकल अपग्रेडेशन किया है। एक नया एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर हमने इंडिजिनस एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर तक बनवाया है। और इस वक्त नौसेना, हमारी भारतीय नौसेना रेड सी के जो पैसेज है, जहां यमेनी पायरेट और सोमाली पायरेट्स का जो उपद्रव चल रहा है,
तो वहाँ आप देख रहे होंगे कि भारतीय नौसेना का जो वहाँ पेट्रोलिंग चल रहा है उसके वजह से, केवल उसके वजह से इस वक्त रेड सी और सुएज कैनाल खुला है, क्योंकि वहाँ अमेरिकी नौसेना भी है, लेकिन वो हुतीज पे वहाँ दूर दूर से मिसाइल भेजते हैं और कुछ नहीं करते हैं। जो एक्चुअल बोर्डिंग करना पड़ता है किसी एक पायरेट कंट्रोल्ड शिप को और उसको अटैक किया जाता है, उसको सराउंड किया जाता है, वो जो ऑन बूट्स ऑन द ग्राउंड कहा है वो पूरी तरह से भारतीय नौसेना कर रही है इस वक्त। और पिछले शायद 6 महीने में 40 ऐसे जहाज होंगे जिस पे हम लोगों ने बोर्डिंग किया है या कुछ एक्शन लिया है हमें, 40 ऐसे जहाज होंगे। तो एक तरीके से ये जो शिपिंग लेन है इस वक्त पूरी तरह से भारतीय नौसेना के लिए चालू है। और एक तरीके से आप कह सकते हैं कि हम लोग एक झटके में एक ग्लोबल पावर बन गए हैं इसकी वजह से, क्योंकि ये जो पैसेज है ये दुनिया का सबसे महत्वपूर्ण मैरीटाइम पैसेज है। तो एक तरफ ये रेड सी वाला है और दूसरे तरफ मलाक्का स्ट्रेट, दोनों पे हम लोग मतलब हम उस पर हमारा भी कंट्रोल है। तो इस तरीके से एक अलग सी जो सोच है हमारे जियो स्ट्रेटेजिक थिंकिंग में वो दिख रहा है, आपको साफ दिख रहा होगा अभी ऑलरेडी।
I'm interested in knowing about, like, you have outlined your strategy about sending voyages and how the historical legacy will be playing a very important role in it. For example, the Bali Yatra. Now, what I am seeing is currently much of the naval activity is oriented towards the western coast. Compared to that, in eastern India, the situation of ports, particularly in Odisha and Bengal, is comparatively poorer. Though the government, of course, must be investing in logistics, but I'm interested in knowing that what new efforts are being made to revive the ports in the eastern coast. Particularly, ports like Kolkata are declining. I mean, what steps are being taken in this regard?
I mean, the decline of Kolkata's river port is an old issue. I mean, when I was your age, it was debated. Even before that, it was debated. And one of the reasons for building Haldia was as a replacement. But so far, Haldia has never lived up to its expectations, and in fact, it has its own silting problem. So Paradip has, to the extent there has been a major port on our eastern seaboard, Paradip has sort of been built, but really, frankly, we need to see our eastern seaboard. And I'm talking about the northeastern seaboard. I think the lower seaboard still has Nagapattinam, Chennai, etc., those ports. But if you go further up the coast, you're absolutely right, we need some serious port there. Ironically, that's where our biggest ports historically used to be, Tamralipti and Chandraketugarh. And it turns out that even in those times, silting was a major problem, because after all, ultimately Tamralipti was abandoned because of silting. But yeah, I mean, there is no doubt that we need a serious port in that end of the coastline. And yes, I mean, there has been many attempts. There is also a new idea near Haldia to build yet another port. So these debates have been going on, but it's an expensive thing to do, as you know. And ultimately, a big new port will probably have to be done by the private sector.
Good evening, sir. Sir, my question is that, as you told that there has been a nexus between Navy and temple banks and the artisans and artisan guilds down south, sir. But during your lecture, sir, you told that there was a Turkic invasions in the north, so there was a total collapse of guilds. But down south they couldn't pass through the Deccan. Then why there was a collapse during the mid-century between?
No, so that's not what I said. Actually, this was true of all our temples. So, for example, if you visit Somnath in Gujarat, the thing that will strike you is that the temple of Somnath is on the beach. Why was it on the beach? Because Somnath was a port, right? So that's why it is on the beach, and Somnath was a very major port of call, and so was Dwarka and all these places. So these places were all port towns, And they had big temples which had a lot of gold and hence attracting. So it is not the case that only South Indian temples were doing this. North Indian temples were also doing this. So they were a source of funding, and the North India was also trading. I mean, inland trade was also funded. It's not just maritime trade, inland trade, industry, etc. was also funded by these temples which were obliterated. Southern India faced it little later, but it is not the case that Southern Indian temples did not face this. Southern India saw the raids, for example, of Malik Kafur and so on, which had devastating impact on the southern ports and large temples. So all the major southern temples, they were also raided and their gold was taken away. It's a different matter than many of them. The structures were not pulled down or they were revived afterwards because for large periods of time, they were under, for example, the Vijayanagar and other empires who were capable of keeping them or rebuilding them. Whereas in the north, those temples were not rebuilt. So the Somnath temple, as I said, was just like any other southern temple. It was a port, it had a temple, it was doing banking, it was just wiped out.
Hello, my name is Anup Kumar Das. I went to Lothal in December, but museum was closed, and I think museum is going to be inaugurated there. So what is your timeline to build the Maritime?
So I don't know what exactly is the timeline for building that museum. So I'm not involved in that, but I believe a lot of effort is being put into building it. But let me say that the ship that I talked about, after we have done all these voyages, the idea is to take that ship to that Lothal museum and display it there. But I don't know about the current status of the Maritime Museum. I have nothing to do with Maritime.
Okay.